Welcome to this panel, Peace, Justice, and the Kitchen Sink, the Role of Governance in the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Derek Brinkerhoff. I'm the co-chair, along with Tom Bridle, of the SID work group on governance rights and democracy. And we have, I think, a great panel here that's going to talk about the issues around this goal, which commonly referred to as the governance SDG. And Tom and I thought that would be a really interesting topic for us in SID, given that there's such a broad array of targets in this goal that are talked about as underlying all of the other Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got Kristen Lord, who's CEO of IREX, as our esteemed moderator here, who will keep control of the panel end of the room. And then we've got three, I think, really great speakers. On the far end there is Tony Pippa of USAID, who's been the USAID envoy to the SDG process up in New York with the UN. Chris Murgatroyd, who is with UNDP, kindly DFID loaned him to the UN to be engaged in the discussion process. And then we have Dr. Mariana Dahan from the World Bank, who is also working on this 2030 agenda, and I encourage you to download the app that Catherine mentioned that lists more details on our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kristen to get us started here. So off to you.
Thank you so much, Derek, and thanks to all of you for being here today. The topic of our discussion today is SDG Goal 16, which is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, inclusive institutions at all levels. You all have a handout that lays out the details of this, but suffice it to say, it ranges from such objectives as reducing all forms of violence, promoting the rule of law, and ensuring equal access for all, substantially reducing corruption and bribery, ensuring public access to information and protecting fundamental freedoms, so on and so forth. So as you can see, it is an incredibly ambitious goal. It is an incredibly complex goal. It may be the most important goal, and I'd argue that peace and justice and good governance are the enabling conditions that allow all the other goals to be achieved or will keep them from being achieved. But it is certainly no small task at all. So to help us today to discuss these issues, we have a number of distinguished panelists. They're going to each spend just a few minutes giving a presentation. Then I'm going to pose a few questions. And some of the issues that we'd like to address as a group are, what are really the links, the trade-offs, and the priorities among this incredibly ambitious list of goals? What are the strategies and the tactics that countries are going to, and other institutions are going to use in order to achieve them? What are the practical and political obstacles to achieving such an ambitious range of goals? And I'd add also, what are really the opportunities here? You know, what might be some areas where we can make the most progress? And then also, how can donors and development implementers engage the countries themselves, the governments, the legislators, the citizens, NGOs, and the private sector to work together to advance its goals? But it is a formidable task, and we're going to turn to Mariana first to tell us how to achieve it.
Hello everyone, I'm very happy to be here. I am currently a Senior Operations Officer in the Office of the Senior Vice President, responsible for the 2030 Agenda, the UN relations, and the partnerships. So this is a specific unit that we've created at the World Bank to address the challenges related to the SDGs. Previously, I ran the Identification for Development agenda at the World Bank as well for about 2 years. And this is an agenda that was looking at how can we as a community empower people by giving them a legal identity. And you may know that in fact there are about 1.5 billion people in the world today who cannot assert their identity, and for that matter could be considered as if they don't exist. The problem disproportionately affects women in various circumstances who could not get an official ID, children whose births have not been registered at birth, and there are about 170 million of those under the age of 5, or even more, we don't know. That data is missing on this. So indeed it's a huge development problem, and the World Bank has decided to address it by launching the ID4D agenda in 2014, and it aligns very well with the SDG goal 16, and specifically the target 16.9, which is provide legal identity to all, including birth registration. So I'll be happy to talk to you more about it today.
Hi, Chris Murgatroyd, working with UNDP in a small unit focusing exclusively on Goal 16. We can come on in the discussion perhaps in a little bit to talk about the distinction between the numerology Goal 16 as a concept versus peace, justice and inclusive societies. But at the moment we're focusing on Goal 16. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the issues around interlinkages, practicalities and so forth.
Thanks. And Tony Pippa, given the experience and the that I had last year and actually over the last 3+ years in helping develop SDGs, I just want to provide sort of a beginning sort of broad overview of where we've come and where Goal 16 fits in it. Would you?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you
Sure.
go ahead and do that, Tony?
Sure, and I
That'd be
think,
great.
you know, so I think one of the things to really start with is the SDGs overall and the political commitment that they represent. And, you know, the importance of that political commitment, and I think, you know, given that the SDGs, the process of developing them was different than the MDGs, and it was much more of a bottom-up and an inclusive and transparent process. So I think we have a great deal of ownership from developed and developing countries alike on the SDGs themselves. And I think it's groundbreaking to have a goal within the overall framework that really focuses on the elements that Kristen laid out. I mean, in some respects, from a US perspective, we think it's extremely important to development and development success, and we think the evidence points that way. But to have the global community embrace that and agree to that and come to consensus on that, I think really is a historic step forward. And I think it recognizes the importance of these issues of peace, governance, inclusivity, that not only are they fundamental components of development in their own right, but they're also essential enablers of other facets of development. And that's one of the key, I think, distinctions of the SDGs as opposed to the MDGs, is that idea of integration. I think the SDGs really are a holistic, integrated framework. They're going to challenge countries to make progress on different dimensions of development at once, certainly without backsliding on other dimensions of development as they focus or emphasize on a particular area. And I think the 2030 Agenda really reflects our understanding of what drives development progress. As Kristen mentioned, you know, the dimensions of Goal 16 really provide us a central nexus for impact on lots of different areas of the development agenda. Even around the summit for when the SDGs were adopted, when President Obama joined his counterparts, USAID rolled out a vision for ending extreme poverty. And if you look closely at that vision and that policy vision, you know, inclusive economic growth that is underpinned by responsive governance, strength of governance, rule of law, is really the fundamental thing that undergirds that entire theory of change that we rolled out in our policy vision. When you look at the USAID's Democracy, Rights, and Governance Strategy, which was rolled out in 2013, integration and how the fourth development objective in that strategy is about how our development outcomes in different dimensions like food security, like global health, like reducing poverty, are improved through the integration of DRG principles and practices. So we believe the evidence is there, and we were, certainly we were strong advocates of Goal 16 and the development of the overall agenda. At the same time, and I think, so I do lots of events around the SDGs, and I hear lots of things around Goal 16. And I have to say, most of the time, the perspective from those that were outside feel like what's captured in Goal 16, many I think see it as an agenda that was pushed by developed countries. They see it as a sort of a northern agenda that was pushed by traditional donors like the US. And I have to remind you that nothing happens in the UN, and you certainly don't come to consensus on anything within the UN without the strong support and advocacy of developing countries themselves. And so I think it's important for us to keep in mind that Goal 16 is on the agenda because of the strong advocacy and support of the African Union and some key countries within the African Union, because of strong support from lots of developing countries who see it as fundamental and elemental to development success. And in fact, as we've been thinking at USAID about how we support the implementation of the SDGs, we did a survey of our missions in the field, and we got 39 responses from different missions around the world. And actually, when we asked what are the top 5 priorities that you hear being talked about in your countries where you're working, the Goal 16 tied with global health on those particular responses. And you can see that sense of country ownership and that sense of country leadership as going to be really important and fundamental to the success of this goal. Having said that, and having again, highlighted the inclusivity and the transparency of the process of developing the SDGs, a process that the Secretary General called the most inclusive and transparent in UN history, I think it's very interesting that as action moves to the country level, we're also facing a time in which you see significant closing of civil society space around the world as well. And so there's great promise, I think, in the model that the inclusivity and the transparency of the process of developing the SDGs provides us. But I think we have to fulfill that promise as we move to country action. And I think we want to see the same sort of dialogue with lots of external stakeholders, with citizens themselves, as countries start to plan and start to think about how they move forward on the SDGs. I think the final point that I would end with is a point around the universality of the SDGs. And coming back to that point that I was talking about, where I think the perception might be there's a difference between a northern and a southern agenda here, but really we're hoping to break down these silos even within implementation of this goal. But this is also something that the U.S. itself, through its own domestic work, can lead by example on. And in fact, we did an event around the summit where we adopted the SDGs. We had a senior official from the U.S. Domestic Policy Council there. We rolled a presidential memorandum out on access to justice and legal aid for the poor in the U.S. And I think providing us an opportunity to integrate work that we're doing domestically and what we're learning, and what we're learning about the evidence and how that can apply and what we can learn from what's going on internationally, I think really serves us well, particularly around issues of Goal 16.
Thank you, Tony. Krista, do you want to say a few words?
Thank you very much, Kristen. Yes, just to add perhaps a little perspective on some of the interlinkages, some of the practicalities, and some of the engagement. Those are the questions that, as Kristen mentioned, we're going to come on to discuss. I just wanted to, in the spirit of Goal 16, a little bit of audience participation. I know you've all had coffee, so everybody's awake. I'm kind of assuming that there's a mixed range of engagements so far with Goal 16, that maybe there are some who are already very firmly focused on Goal 16 as distinct perhaps from the individual targets. Are there anybody there who's prepared to put their hand up as already working on Goal 16 as a new thing, the SDGs? Yep, great. Very good, thank you, and doesn't surprise me unduly that there aren't more, because I'm assuming that most of us in here are in the category that know generally about the 10+2 targets, as we might call them in Goal 16. Maybe don't have all of the tattoos like some of us, but know a little bit. If I was to call out 16.4, for example, you'd know instinctively what? Okay, good. So at least we know as a community what Goal 16 is broadly about, even if we haven't engaged in detail. And I know that all of you will come from one or other of those different disciplines that is featured in the list that Kristen began to introduce. And that's what I wanted to say in terms of the emerging challenges as a community of practice. Before Goal 16 and last September, albeit we'd seen it coming, and I'll say a word about interlinkages on that score as well, it's a brand new thing. And it sets us a challenge as practitioners to work out how we work together to maximize those interlinkages. So the first set of questions on interlinkages, I mean, you look at the list and it seems a little bit random, and the way in which, as the organisers have pointed out, there are different levels perhaps. Do we want to eradicate? Do we want to substantially reduce? Do we want to address? But actually, as Tony mentions, there is a theory behind them. They came out of the high-level panel 2 or 3 years ago through the open working group. So we recognise that these are the right underpinnings and that they're the things that we want to work on. But making the most of those interlinkages and ensuring that when we talk about legal identity, for example, we're clear that it allows people to access services which protect them from violence, which allow them to get redress for perceived wrongs through the courts, which allow them even to interact with inclusive institutions, which, if you look at 16.6 in the middle of the agenda, is potentially the biggest black box, and as a community of practitioners sets us the biggest challenge. How do we get into what an effective institution is? So there is a coherence for all the apparent randomness. But the final thing I want to say about interlinkages before coming on to some of the other practicalities is that there are linkages across different parts of the entire agenda. As Kristen says, and Tony echoed, this is the underpinnings. But what does that mean in practice? The best I've seen so far in 2 dimensions is what I very rudely refer to as the spaghetti and marshmallow approach to mapping those interlinkages. In other words, where does Goal 16 plug into Goal 5, for example? Reducing violence in parts of Goal 5, reducing violence in parts of Goal 16. There's a direct link there. Goal 11, safe cities. Same again, 16.1, plugging straight into aspects of Goal 11. That's fine on one level, but it misses some of the richness and complexity, and it's a little bit like that longitude challenge from centuries past. If somebody could do a real 3-dimensional mapping of how the whole thing fits together, I think that would be fantastic. And that's leaving aside, of course, the human rights architecture and some of the other broader issues that we need to keep in mind. Very brief word about practicalities. I mentioned at the beginning, are there people who are already working on Goal 16 as a distinct thing? I think it's important to keep a focus on that. I think we do get tripped up by the numbers, and being frank, from a UNDP perspective, the Secretary General has been very clear that goals are not for owning or leading by any agency, and that's absolutely fundamental. But still, Goal 16 is in the framework and will be reported against. And I think it's valid to keep a focus on it as a distinct thing, because there are countries that we all work with that are already active on reducing violence rates of homicide, already active on the rule of law, already active on public service management reform, for example. What does that mean in the new context? And I think for us, from a UNDP perspective, it means asking countries to work and to think perhaps about the coherence. So to plan for delivery of Goal 16 and to budget effectively. Are we making sure that those other aspects of delivery are taken care of? Are countries preparing to measure, monitor and report? And I'll say a word at the end about reporting. Are we learning lessons? And this again I think is where the UN has a fantastic opportunity to convene and bring people together without being seen to own, but to make sure that experience in this region is available to practitioners in other regions. And finally, on that note, to think about partnerships differently. What does it mean at the global, the national and the local level? So we're working as a the UN community on those aspects in support of member states. But the last set of things I want to say very briefly, Christian, is just in terms of engagement. Your schedule for the session quite rightly says, how do we engage people? How do we get people into this? For us, it's about reporting. In other words, how do we help communities in all of the member states where we offer support to engage, to demonstrate progress? What does it actually mean to make progress on Goal 16? And how can you be sure? We might talk a lot in the discussion about indicators. There's been an awful lot of focus coming out of the process that Tony described into the Statistical Commission about measurement. But as we know, much as resources follow what is measured, it's often more about what you miss than what you measure. If Tony had been attacked on the way to the convention centre today and reported it to the police, that attack would feature in official statistics. If I'd been attacked but was afraid of the police and didn't go, it wouldn't appear in official statistics. So admin data only gets you some of the broad spectrum of what we're interested in. So how do we get people to focus on reporting? And I think that's a really good way in. And in the discussion, we'll talk perhaps a little about some of the work UNDP's been doing with member countries, Rwanda, Tunisia, Albania, Indonesia, and even the UK on aspects of measurement and reporting. And in that context, I'll leave by just saying that the work coined the new phrase north-south learning and south-north learning, where people are actually in the UK system looking very hard at what's going on in Albania, in Indonesia, in Rwanda, to see what can be learned. So that focus on reporting for me, Kristin, as part of engagement is fundamental.
Great. And Mariana, can you spend just a few minutes educating us on this issue of identification? I mean, it does really stand out when one reads the goals that this is much more specific than many of the others. So help us understand why this specific issue became so fundamental to achieving SDG Goal 16?
I would even say that this is fundamental to achieving all the SDGs agenda, because as the 2030 Development Agenda says, leave no one behind. How can you actually know who is that one person, who is that last person, without having an identity for her or for him? So I would say that this is a target that is actually a red thread through the entire agenda. And we've done some research on that. We've initiated this with the Center for Global Development, and we identify that these numbers are approximate, but still pretty huge to imagine that at least a third of the world today doesn't have means to prove their identity. So for development agencies like us, that means that we don't know who is actually accessing the services, the social benefits programs that governments are designing for the citizens, those who don't have a voice. That's what it means not to have an identity. And Chris and I are just back from New York, where we've attended the ID 2020 summit at UN last Friday, which was an extraordinary convening of different stakeholders, including private sector, civil society. And I was really touched by some witnesses who came to talk about their experience of being trafficked, of being abducted, and only because at some point they were able to prove their age. For example, in the case of a young girl who was taken into the prostitution circuit, she was able to escape judgment and prison even. So I think the impact of having an identity is to the overall justice and governance agenda is huge, but also I would say this is what helps gender empowerment. This is also what helps escaping poverty, reducing inequalities. So really it's something fundamental to the entire agenda. Now, more in terms of practicalities, and I very much liked how you talked about the interlinkages and the measurement. How are we measuring progress? This is one target that was very difficult to measure because in its formulation, it conflated two different notions. One is provide legal identity, so legal identification, then we can argue what is legal, what is official, what is non-legal, but still an identity. And then birth registration, which is another subset of the legal identification, but still it stops at a certain point. And with a birth certificate in so many countries, you cannot claim your right to vote or be entitled to property or even divorce with a birth certificate. You would need a legal ID that is being recognized by the state. However, after a lot of debate, and I think this has been a very heated one, we came up, in the sense of the broader development community and especially the government, with one indicator for this target. The indicator says we will measure proportion of children under 5 years of age whose births have been registered with a civil servant by age. So it does state the need to register children, but it does not state how we are going to measure progress towards legal identification. So the debate is still ongoing. I think we all should contribute to enrich with our thoughts, with our experience. And now, again, coming from New York, we see that different stakeholders are putting their weight on the table and coming with new technologies that perhaps could help us go around the problem of legal identification and leverage digital technology, distributed ledger platforms, blockchains of this world. And I'm agnostic to any type of technology, but I do believe innovation can help us achieve many of these challenges. And at the World Bank, we are very much engaged into this agenda. In fact, it's one of the top 5 priorities of the World Bank today, and we have a multi-stakeholder group. We partner, like Tony mentioned, with African Union, with other stakeholders that go outside, what is called the northern pool of competency. We, in fact, believe that this one target is going to be driven by the willingness to advance and the leadership of developing countries, where the bulk of unregistered people is the biggest, the greatest. And these are countries in Africa and in Asia. So finally, I would like to echo the need for partnership. It's the SDG goal 17, which is cross-cutting to all of them. But here, with regard to target 16.9, I think partnership is what will help us bridge the knowledge gap, bridge the funding gap, and also leverage all our advocacy power, convening power, so that we can assist countries at best and leave no one behind.
Great, thanks so much. Tony, I'd like to go back to a point you made about closing spaces around the world, and I wanted to ask the panel, how do we think about SDG goal 16 in non-democratic societies? I mean, coming from a democratic society, when you read this goal, we really interpret this with a very particular lens. And I'm just wondering if the panel can share with the audience some thoughts on how this goal will be interpreted in non-democratic societies. How much progress are we likely to make on this goal given those differences in opinion? And just generally, how do we deal with the fact that there are some very, very different normative frameworks in societies around the world that they're bringing to the table and thinking about this goal?
I can start us off there. So I think coming back to, first off, to the conversation that we're starting to have already around data is really important. Because think of what the MDGs actually helped us do, even on some very specific things around global health where we didn't have universally accepted benchmarks and indicators. The SDGs, if we can use them in the same way and build that momentum, should give us an opportunity to start to build that sort of accepted standards internationally. Now, I think there's going to be challenges within governments and even in their official statistical offices of having the data and the quality of the data and the methodology and the refinements to be able to provide that. But I also think because of, and I'll come back to the part of partnership, because of the acceptance that the SDGs are going to require the resources and the engagement of all elements of society and multiple stakeholders. It provides us an opportunity also for civil society and others to be providing data and be providing some ballast about what progress looks like. This is going to be a challenge. I mean, the SDGs themselves as a holistic framework are challenging. They're very wide-ranging. And so governments themselves are going to, we don't see this as a pick and choose menu, but governments themselves are going to emphasize certain areas of the agenda that they are going to want to drive forward on progress. And that means that some of the more controversial aspects, maybe within that particular political or cultural context, might be given less priority or given less focus. And I think we have to be attentive to that. At the same time, this is a political consensus and a political commitment. So even from a US perspective, it gives us an opportunity to have a particular dialogue and type of conversation with countries who have signed up to this, and for us all to hold our own feet to the fire on being accountable to what's in Goal 16. But I'll let colleagues take it even further, because there's going to be a challenge. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we have.
No doubt about it. And if I can just add briefly, Kristen, I mean, it for me does come back to the fact, as Tony emphasized, that having Goal 16 in the overall sustainable development framework in a way that hasn't happened before now is groundbreaking. So the focus that I put earlier on reporting means that there will be countries who are committed to these concepts and principles who will voluntarily report on them. And already in UNDP, we're working with countries who are keen to start to occupy some of that space. I mentioned the names of the countries that had helped to pilot some of this thinking. And our expectation is that as that momentum around voluntary reporting grows, more and more countries will come to see the benefit. The first challenge I threw out to us as a group of practitioners, hitherto perhaps governance has been seen as a kind of expert domain that countries are reported on in terms of their governance, whether it's the PFAR framework on financial management, whether it's other metrics and indicators, and there are a good number of them out there. But for the first time, this is countries voluntarily reporting on their own progress. So if we can energize and galvanize, starting with those countries that are willing and committed to this agenda, we're expecting that process will gain momentum. Part of an answer, and I'm trying not to be naive, but I think it's an important part of the answer, Kristen.
Yeah, and just to complete, I think what we are trying to do as development players is to also see what are the indicators over which we could be custodian agencies. And this builds on our strengths, and each of the agencies have historically been taking the lead on several data sets and indicators. Now we are going through the exercise of aligning them to the SDGs, and the World Bank, for example, has a flagship publication which is GRI, but we have agreed, for example, with respect to Goal 16, to be the custodian for two indicators, which are 16.5 and 16.6, and we want to expand the existing data sets, to work with statistical offices in the countries, to have them get the baseline right, and then report each year on their progress and collect that data using innovative tools. So we are putting our weight behind their efforts, and also sometimes funding. And I think given the 230 indicators that are attached to the SDGs agenda, so the huge number of indicators which we have to monitor as a development community. I think each of us has to really put hands on deck, as we say, and support the countries. Otherwise, what is not measured is not being counted, and those may not count for us. So this is the philosophy that we are trying to promote in our client countries as well.
And I'm going to press you all just a little bit, because you've all emphasized the importance of measurement, and I doubt you'll get much opposition in this room for that. And you've also been very diplomatic in suggesting that, we'll collect things and that, this will help us to monitor. But really, if we're honest, the whole point of having a goal is that it creates some pressure to change, whether that's pressure within countries themselves, whether that's pressure from the international community, whether that pressure comes from just a desire to be known as a leader, or whether it actually creates a more political and a hard-edged form of pressure. Could you talk a little bit more about exactly how we're hoping that this reporting will lead to real change in terms of addressing the goals?
From our perspective, Kristen, we need, and the reference to being diplomatic is critical, because as UN agencies, as the UN system, we are a function of our member states. There's no doubt about that. But what we're really trying to encourage is new forms of partnership and new ways of looking at the importance of reporting. So for all member states, there will be incentives, whether it's responding to criticism from civil society, perhaps, whether it's working with private sector partners who have an interest in engaging with member states in a particular way. There will be ways of approaching this in each of the member states that are interested. Again, though, I think it is legitimate to point to those countries that are interested, first and foremost, in being associated with this goal and saying this is how we're proposing to do it. It's going to be messy, and I think even with a real commitment to Goal 16, those countries that are already in that space acknowledge that it's going to be messy and difficult. But I think the more we can generate not just hard measurement and data, because that's going to be particularly tricky when you come on to talk about survey methodologies, for example. Even the question of designing questionnaires is going to throw up a load of issues in a number of different countries. But the more we get positive stories from those countries that are already working, the more that will help to encourage others to get involved.
I would add on that, and I think, I really like, and this is the way we've been thinking about it, this idea of first movers who are really taking it seriously and providing it. Because when you think about it, the data is there's two different uses. One is an accountability use. How well are we doing on the goals, and how well are countries doing on the goals? But the other is also having the evidence and data that provides policymakers and stakeholders in country to actually make good decisions and to help drive forward on the goals. And so having a set of countries who are taking this on and moving it forward helps with the accountability conversation, even within the official architecture, because they provide a model and they provide a sense of what's possible and what's also important. But I think the other thing, and this is one of the reasons why I think Goal 16 even stayed on the agenda throughout the negotiations, is because of the evidence showing about the impact that it has on the other dimensions throughout the agenda, on the social and human dimensions of development that were coming out of the MDGs, on the new things that were added also to the agenda in terms of economic growth and inequality and environmentalism and environmental sustainability. So you would hope that that data also provides us an ever-expanding set of evidence that shows the linkage and the importance of what's in Goal 16 to progress on those other parts of the agenda as well. And so I think it's a both and. But by the same token, it will take some time. When you think about the MDGs, think about how long it took to provide some momentum even on the initial data gathering and indicators on the MDGs, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. I think we have a better head start here because of the process itself has spurred momentum early on. But I think we also have to be, reasonable about the difficulty that we might have with it. One would also hope, though, that with types of partnerships and being creative, we might be able to leapfrog things with technology and other types of approaches.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring up an example, which is a well-known one. The World Bank, as you know, works on doing business report, and it's an index that, in a sense, ranks countries on the transparency around doing business. Although it was disputed at the beginning, it really now became a landmark and a flagship publication, and countries are really competing with each other to top the ranks and prove that they can do better with our help, of course, but also by learning themselves how to improve the environment of doing business. So with respect to the SDGs, it could also be a compass to think that the countries could be ranked, rated, but this creates some controversy, and we may distance ourselves from that specific instrument that worked for the doing business, only because it is such a complex agenda, and especially goal 16, there are so many soft dimensions that it would be hard to really measure performance of one country versus another. However, to echo the ideas here, I think providing a forum for countries to shine and to prove that they've done well is something that the UN agencies are already putting in place. In fact, the high-level political forum in July this year will invite 22 countries who want to prove that they already started implementing the SDGs and they are doing it well. And also the World Bank is working with these countries to assist other countries that would like to be collaborating, and we are setting up twinning arrangements between these countries so that transfer of expertise is happening. And again, it's not only a north-south. A lot of these 22 countries are actually coming from developing world. So I think a lot of countries there want to be the leaders in this space, and I can, for example, name Colombia or Liberia as one of those countries who will be on stage in July, and I think this is a great progress.
Great, thank you. Well, you should all get your questions and comments ready, because I'm going to turn to you in the audience in just a moment. But let me ask one last question myself for the panel, and that's this. All three of you really emphasize this issue of partnerships. And I know those partnerships can take many different forms. Could you speak a little bit and share with the audience your views on what you see as being the biggest opportunities in terms of partnerships? Where can we make the most progress through partnerships?
So I'll be brief just because I just talked about the twinning. So I think that's where we can make the most progress in terms of SDG goals measurement and implementation.
I think there's some really interesting opportunities with a new agenda to bring people together in different ways. What you might see in other situations, for example, is a government report, a shadow report. You might see one version of what's going on and then a contested version. With Goal 16, there's an opportunity at the moment to try and bring some of those constituencies together. I mean, Mariana was absolutely right in terms of the number of indicators and the custodian role that's going to need to be played. A lot of the data that we're going to need for those 231 indicators doesn't exist in official national databases. NGOs, I mean, as Tony mentioned, and others, business collects data for its own purposes. How do we bring people together and start brokering some of that trust? Again, without being naive, there are incentives for people to come together and understand what's out there so that we can make the best use of it. And there's an obligation on civil society, just as there is on government, to make sure that their methodologies are transparent, that everybody understands how it's happening. So there's a new opportunity, I think, to relate differently. Final point as well on interlinkages. For example, when we come to talk about cities, there are municipalities and other actors that maybe haven't been part of the traditional discourse. Again, we can bring those together. Youth groups, in a way, for the 2030 agenda that perhaps weren't part of the MDGs. So there are new opportunities.
Yeah, just picking up the point on cities, I was at a launch that the OECD did with a bunch of mayors from around the world on inclusive growth in cities. And again, the underpinning of inclusive economic growth, I mean, a lot of what's in Goal 16 is going to be necessary for that, and so it brings new constituencies into that. You know, at a global level, USAID's been, you know, we've been involved with others like the UK, like Sweden, like the Mid-ER network on Making All Voices Count, which is trying to use technology and IT as a way to create that circle of responsiveness between citizens and governments. But I would say that on this particular goal, one, it's new to the agenda, so I think that's partly a reason for this, but it's also one where I think we have, one, because it's so wide-ranging, you have different international coalitions that have pieces of the goal, but you don't have a sort of one place within the international architecture that's sort of like that multi-stakeholder partnership or that big coalition that brings it all together. So you have the Open Government Partnership. You know, you have the international dialogue on peace building and state building that came out of the New Deal for fragile states. You have the Effective Institutions Platform. All of these, I think, provide us some platform to both elevate, bring in new partners, to continue to roll the momentum forward. But it also provides us a bit of a challenge because it's not like, you know, when you look at the goal on global health, it's not like you have the WHO and that's where everybody comes together and you know, thinks about where are the gaps and where can we develop multi-stakeholder partnerships to fill those gaps. And so I think we have to be attentive to that, and I think we have to continue the dialogue amongst many different stakeholders and amongst many different types of countries and continue to keep the momentum high as we move toward implementation.
Great, thank you, Tony. And now is your opportunity to ask questions. Would you kindly come up to the microphones? There are two set up here. Introduce yourself, name of your organization, ask your question, and then I'll try and, my job will be to try and keep the discussion moving so we get as many questions in as possible. So only this side of the room seems to have questions, but we'll fill in. Yes,
point
sir.
out this is the left side of the room. I don't know how my colleagues are going to do on the right. Thank you. It was a really wonderful discussion, and just Tony, in the last moment, this isn't really aimed at you, but in the last moment, you've emphasized also the peace-building set of emphases within Goal 16. None of you really discussed that too much, and yet I think there was a lot of interest in a recognition that the enormous resource allocation necessary for the humanitarian and for other development goals could pinch seriously the opportunity Goal 16 provides for a serious investment launch and at least philosophical discussion about peace building as a discipline, as the functions that are supposed to be included in that. There was a question, but there was a wonderful presentation by President Kim, by your predecessor, Kristen, from Nancy, from USIP, and by Jan Liason, that now we must look at the continuum of peace building, investment in preventing conflict, in order to have any of the other areas of the goals have a chance, including governance. So how do you see now the discussion and the indicators, investment, but more importantly, the practical investments in UN agencies and the conflict prevention parts of the bank and USAID is getting a piece of the pie that will make it possible for this to move forward with a whole new era of investment and I don't know, courage, I guess, for lack of another word. Could you expand on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Can I piggyback on that for the panel and ask you to directly address this question of resources, because this may be one of the areas, the peace building agenda may be one of the areas that is most under-resourced, in my opinion, relative to the size of the challenge. And just to give a very practical example, Stephen mentioned my history with USIP. The annual appropriation for USIP from the U.S. Institute of Peace from the Congress is about $37 million, just to give you a sense of the scope of the challenge and the size of the resources. So would the three of you address this issue of the peace building agenda and how we're going to find the resources to address it? As well as all the other elements of the question, which went far beyond resources.
I represent the United Nations Association of Well-being of this, and that's one of the areas we're promoting. Thank you.
Do you want to take more than one question at a time, Kristen, or we'll take this one?
That's a pretty big one, so why don't we take that one and then maybe we'll collect a couple after that.
I can briefly perhaps bring the example of the MENA financing facility that the World Bank just recently launched with all its partners in supporting countries who are welcoming a lot of refugees and thus hindering on their own development and using their own infrastructure and domestic resources. And I'm talking about Jordan and Lebanon. And these are the first two countries that qualify for concessional loans at the bank, and we have leveraged, I have the figure here, about $5.2 billion to start with, so that these countries can tap into this funding pool and strengthen their own infrastructure. I think this type of initiatives, which illustrate both our engagement in conflict-affected countries, in supporting peace building, and also addressing the refugee crisis, while also coming with innovative financing mechanisms. And I invite you all to go through the press releases about that. It's a bit complex how they managed to pull all that funding together, but overall, working with different partners, including the Islamic Development Bank, for example, and leveraging Islamic finance helps us, address the funding challenge.
No, go ahead. Go. I was just going to say that, of course, there's no easy answer. Part of what I think is part of an answer is being very clear that we are working across the different pillars of the UN system. I can speak from a UNDP perspective, Kristen, but the importance of bringing those actors together from the peace and security pillar, from the development pillar, from the humanitarian human rights pillar, and that is happening. And I think Goal 16 particularly gives an encouragement for that to happen increasingly quickly. There are funding windows that UNDP has, for example, which make it very clear that our governance is for sustaining peace. The work that we do on governance is deliberately to sustain peace, whether it's inclusive political processes, conflict prevention, in so many words. Those are things that we want to emphasize to our potential donors and supporters. And of course, some of those cross-UN funds, the Peace Building Commission and the Peace Building Fund that already exists, UNDP works as an implementer. So again, there are constituencies that are coming together in a way that wasn't happening before.
I mean, I think a couple of things I would say. One, as we have a delegation at the World Humanitarian Summit right now, as we look at sort of the interplay between what we're experiencing in terms of crisis and movement of peoples and others around the world, and how that links to development, and sort of from a long-term development perspective, we have been challenging ourselves within the U.S. government and USAID particularly on how we strengthen the resilience of communities as well as political structures to be able to withstand things that are happening either in their neighborhood or kinds of discussions that are happening internally. I think that's not as much as a resourcing question, but how do we use the processes that we have more effectively and sort of more in an integrated fashion? How do we strategically plan together, both from a humanitarian perspective and from a long-term development perspective? And we've also been taking a close look at fragility as well, and we have actually great tools and expertise within the agency on that, but how do we expand them and get them more into the DNA of our own planning processes? And in fact, we've been undertaking some internal work, bureau by bureau, to look at that and look at ways in which we can actually use better what we already have rather than even thinking about putting lots more money into it. I do think the fact that Goal 16 gives us added momentum on things like the work that we've been doing through the New Deal for fragile states, and gives added wind to try to make progress, especially with those countries that have taken on their frameworks. I think over time, and given where we are in the political calendar, it's a little difficult to think about enormous pots of new money going into these issues. But at the same time, I think the political attention has been high. I mean, last year at the UN, President was part of leading a focus on peacekeeping. This year at the UN, we'll have a focus on refugees as well, and sort of the attendant the attendant issues that come along with them, and we've put a lot into the World Humanitarian Summit as well because of that. And so I think the focus is there. I think it will take a little bit of time for the budget conversations and other operational issues to catch up with it, and frankly, it will also depend a little bit on what happens in November and a new political team that comes in as well.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to suggest that we take 3 questions at a time now, and then you 3 can choose which of them you want to respond to, so we don't all of us have to respond to everyone. Can I suggest we take 2 questions on this side and 1 on this side to start, and then we'll start with you, sir, and then go to the other side?
Hello, thank you. I'm John Johnson from Chemonics, and I appreciate the focus on the goals in terms of indicators and measurement and how important that is. And just an anecdote can illustrate some of the challenges, and I'm wondering how you're going to be dealing with these, or your thoughts on this. In Indonesia recently, there was a USAID project that was dealing with education issues, and one of the questions that they had to deal with was attendance of teachers at schools and attendance of students at schools. And there's a great incentive to over-report. And what they discovered is they went into verified data is that it was 100% wrong, that none of it was correct. And because of the incentives built in for this kind of reporting, so just as you go ahead and as you build more of this on indicators, what you're doing or what you're thinking about doing to address issues like this. Thanks.
Very good, thank you.
I'm glad that my question is directly after yours because it is very similar but related. My name is Sarah Ellison and I'm at PACT, and thank you to the whole panel for being here. So again, we talked a lot about data and indicators, and it reminded me a little bit of during the MDGs and we were measuring education, there was a big focus on enrollment. And we had great enrollment, and then we found out there was not a lot of learning happening. And so I'm wondering what kind of incentives we're hoping to put in place around Goal 16 to encourage member states to report on things outside of just the required indicators, to find some of those, like I think you said, Mr. Pippa said, it's as much about what you miss as what you measure. And I felt that that was really important for this goal. So some ideas around that.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Yes, yes, good morning. My name is Michelle Forsley. Thank you very much for your panel. I've been working in the health sector from the perspective of rule of law for about the last 20 years. And I do this in my capacity as a lawyer. And what I notice in so many countries is that there are no lawyers in the health sector. And too often, the legal community is totally uninvolved in the work of development. And I'm posing the question to the panel, how can we better engage the local legal community to become aware of how they can contribute to the work of SDG 16, which fundamentally is about rule of law and all of its implications. And as well, in the development sector, what I observe is that there are generally no lawyers working in it, very few, if any, who are actually doing legal work. And I don't know how we're going to go about the business of translating law into operational day-to-day activities which actually cause the goals to happen, such as registering people. That's an institutional activity. And unless we have these institutions in place with people who understand what's obligated under the law, et cetera, how is it going to happen? So how can we build partnerships with those communities, both at the domestic and international levels, to support this goal? Thank you.
Who would like to start? Tackle those 3 questions.
Shall I go briefly on indicators? And the 2 questions, as you mentioned, Sarah, came together quite usefully. And again, parts of the answers in what we've already introduced, perhaps. I mean, the Indonesia example, maths was never my strong point, but how you get something 100% wrong? Does that mean every single number was completely wrong? Yeah. So that's quite impressive. But it's the, this sense, Indonesia, I mean, a quick plug, the work that we were doing included Indonesia, and they were frank about the challenges of the 30,000 different administrative districts in the different outlying islands. That's a huge logistical challenge. Part of what they did, and what we saw coming through very strongly, was working with the civil society agents that are present in those places, and that you can engage communities, you can get down to that level. And in terms of teacher attendance, people who are expecting those services will be best placed to engage and to assist. So some way of marrying those two things together. It links perhaps to Sarah's question, and briefly, because I'm aware people are standing, so I don't want to keep people waiting. But that sense that the global indicator framework is only ever going to be a partial snapshot of what's required. And again, what we saw coming through this work was that in each country, working with their communities, tried to identify what mattered to them. So there will be, even with the 231 indicators, things that countries will want to do for themselves because it's the right thing to do, and they can generate momentum in that way. So again, we'd use some of this pilot work to encourage that. Engaging lawyers, I should declare an interest. I've practiced as an advocate, so I see some of the challenges there. We know that lawyers are very heavily engaged on the anti-corruption agenda. Work on 16.4, 16.5 around illicit financial flows and anti-corruption is a good way in if we can attract that interest and energy, and then maybe use that to build effective institutions. I'd hope that would be a good entry point.
Do you two have anything to add?
Just to add, to really pick up on that point, because I think it was buried there a little bit. The official architecture of 231 indicators that will come through the UN reporting is going to frustrate everyone who wants to see progress on all the different targets and understand what the progress looks like on the 169 targets underneath the 17 goals. And so what that speaks to is the need for both at the country level, and countries themselves might self-report on different types of indicators that aren't within that particular official architecture, but also lots of partnerships and other stakeholders also commenting on what it looks like to be able to make progress. I mean, the U.S. was part of, with a host of other countries and private sector partners, on launching the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And you will want to see lots of different partnerships. We were talking about the partnership potentially on legal identity. I think this is data, and where data intersects with this particular agenda is very ripe for lots of different types of partnerships, for reporting by civil society organizations, private sector entities that do development, for leveraging data that exists in many different places to be able to shine a light in a particular facet or a particular dimension on the agenda. And I think it's going to have to be sort of commonly accepted that we're all going to do this in some way and sort of share the load on this, because we can direct as much investment as we possibly can to government statistical offices and build the capacity, and we need to do that, and I think we're all committed to doing that. But that is also not going to be able to get us, I think, to where we want to be over the 15 years. I mean, it's just a very wide-ranging agenda, and the targets themselves have lots of different dimensions even in them. So I think we have to be, to be reasonable about that.
Just to add to that, and I'm not an advocate for a specific technology, again, although I have a background in the technologies, but I think there are some tamper-proof technologies that can be used to really overcome the fraud in reporting, and I'm thinking of biometrics and other digital technologies that can help us actually make sure the unicity and the veracity of the data that is being reported it is something verifiable. So, just an idea.
And there may be new technologies that help us leapfrog. When we talk about, we can use geospatial data now to think about reporting in a different way that would complement and may over time even be able to do what we do with household survey reporting now in certain aspects. I think we're going to have to be very creative as we roll this out.
Mm-hmm. So since we have 4 people up at the microphone, I'm going to suggest that we take all 4 questions, and then we should have just about enough time for the panel to address them if we're quick. So, sir, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you for the panel. I'm Talal Barazi from D3 Systems. Just looking through this list, most of these targets are very objective and concise, but then you have other ones where it's more subjective, like the one on 16.6, develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, and the one on corruption. And for me, these seem to be top-down targets rather than the majority of all targets, so you would have to work with governments directly for these. And I was wondering, what actionable steps do you have for these more top-down targets specifically? Thank you.
So I'm actually looking for almost like a case example, maybe Mexico or Colombia or something like that, where if you're aware in your position to describe how certain ideas for reporting are being pursued and what those would look like. I really like what a few people here have mentioned about involving like attorneys, involving other local level law enforcement, things like that. Just curious, Mexico comes to mind immediately just because of a documentary I saw recently, but I could see where legal attachés, for example, would be a good resource, who are connected with, whether it be FBI or local law enforcement, working with sources on the ground, working with journalists, things like these. How is this kind of all holistically coming into play when you're talking about working with civil society and different partners to develop indicators? And is that really the responsibility of local level statistical agencies? If so, like how are you incentivizing that?
And did we get your name?
Yes, it's my name is Sandra Sandoval. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, good morning. Thank you to the panelists. My name is Stephen Dunn. I'm from Cardno's governance team. Tony mentioned in his comments just a second ago that he felt that it was very important that these goals be commonly accepted throughout the development enterprise to have them be focused on and be effective. I was curious to what degree we should expect to see some of the higher level policy and vision and priorities documents like the DRG, the next generation of the DRG strategy document, directly reflect the SDGs, and then kind of drilling down from that high level, should we expect to see this language in country development cooperation strategies or in specific projects as well?
Hi, thank you again for your comments. I'm Amy Kalmbach from Creative Associates. All of you touched briefly on it being kind of a participatory process in creating the SDGs, but I'd like to hear a little bit more on how you see the likely success of the continued inclusiveness and implementation, reporting, and evaluation.
I can start. I think that question was specifically sort of around how this might look in our policy and practices. And I would say, at least where we are right now and what we have underway, yes, we're asking bureaus and others who are working on policy to be thinking about how does their work sort of map to the SDGs. Goal 16 being a part of that, but overall, and in fact, you've had like our Bureau of Food Security when they sat down and we started and engaged in a conversation. They said, well, we've got what we need to, because Goal 2 is all about ending hunger, and we said, no. How does this map across as well, and how does this touch Goal 16? How does this touch other goals? How does it touch what's captured in the gender goal? We are also updating our guidance on community development cooperation strategies and asking countries, our missions, to think about how they use this as an opportunity and how does it integrate with where the country is on their planning. I think one thing I would say is, again, it's a country development cooperation strategy, and so that speaks to sort of the country ownership and the country leadership. So I think we'll continue to start with where countries are and how they're integrating the SDGs and facets and dimensions of Goal 16 into their own development planning. But it also provides us a platform to have that conversation if we think it's a priority, if we think there are priorities within the goal that the country ought to be taking into account. But I think I guess the last point I would say is, rather than looking though as a sort of a compliance exercise and asking our parts of USAID to think about, how do you check the box on the SDGs in what you're doing in terms of a policy or in terms of the CDCS, we really do see this as an opportunity. I mean, frankly, what's in Goal 16 and what's throughout the SDGs is reflective of where the U.S. has been with our official development assistance and our development cooperation and where we've been going with development. So from our perspective, there's a lot of what's reflected in the global goals also reflects a lot of what U.S. priorities have been. And so we ought to look at ways in which we can take what's in the goals and elevate and even highlight or bring greater momentum to particular things that we might think are important. Just to the one question on case studies, Colombia has been doing an enormous amount through its statistical agency as a government in mapping exactly where they have data, what how good that data is, where they have particular gaps, not just for Goal 16, but for the SDGs overall. And in fact, it's quite impressive the amount of progress they've been able to make thus far, and how seriously they've taken it, and how they've also integrated it, even to the way they're thinking about budgeting as an entire government.
Do you want to go next?
Yes, sure. I was thinking about the high-level thematic debate that took place at UN on April 22nd or 21st, I can't remember, but there were 87 countries from all over the world who came to talk about the alignment of their institutions, of their development policies, of their coordination mechanisms, monitoring, reporting. And this is all preceding the high-level political forum, which will take place in July at UN, as I also mentioned. So countries are clearly getting ready, and they are all trying to work together and learn from each other on how they can better align with the SDGs and put in place those mechanisms to report, to monitor progress. One example to bring to how can these countries promote participatory processes more and involve more stakeholders pops up in my mind from Senegal, where with respect to target 16.9, the government was able to attract the private sector, specifically the mobile operators, together with the NGOs that are operating in rural poor areas, and go house from house to register births of children on mobile phones, and then transfer this information to the central authority, to the registrars, who would then process it and issue birth certificates, or even later on ID cards. Hopefully the system in place is robust enough. But this is just one example of how several actors, you have the government, the private sector, and the NGOs, who are working together towards achieving this specific target, 16.9, which is register the births of all the children before age of 5, and they're actually doing it right after birth. So clearly some countries take the lead on being ahead of the curve and innovating with birth registration, for instance, hours after the birth happened, not to wait 5 years. So I'm very optimistic about such type of collaboration and innovation being leveraged for all the targets. So I hope we just need to be there to support them and to create this enabling environment for them to be able to partner in this way.
Kristen, just briefly perhaps to try and link a couple of the questions together, and forgive me if I miss anything, but the question about the top-down targets, Talal, I think your challenge is very fair. There's an awful lot of work that's been done over time to work with central ministries, whether it's public service reform through cabinet offices, or however you want to describe them, public financial management reform through ministries of finance. The landscape has changed, and the way in which those initiatives now are undertaken must allude to the rest of the agenda in a way that simply wasn't connected previously. So I think there will be an attention to that, but it's absolutely right to keep a focus on it and to link it to the other question, I think, Amy, you said about participation and inclusiveness. Unless there's effective oversight of what's going on at the top-down level through the executive by parliaments, there's going to be a disjunct again. And I think it's going to be very important for us, through the work that we do, through inclusive political processes, for example, to make sure that parliaments own the SDGs and are ensuring that there is that oversight, drawing on local level examples. And again, maybe this comes back to the case studies point. You know, the committees that will sit in Parliament to ensure that there is that effective oversight must be working with the local level communities in some way to ensure that accountability. And I think it's just a focus that's required, that when we talk about effective institutions, it must subsume accountable and inclusive. Again, I don't want to take anything for granted, but you cannot be effective unless you're accountable to the people that you serve and truly inclusive.
Just to come back on the inclusive question and point, because I didn't address it in my comments. I do think, again, to that point about what multi-stakeholder partnerships or coalitions are in place. The Open Government Partnership, I think, will be a continuing place where that particular point of inclusiveness and transparency and the engagement of citizens with governments can play a really important role in Goal 16 and in SDG implementation overall. And in fact, they did their own special edition on implementing the 2030 agenda, and I know it was a big part of conversations that have been happening on open government partnership gatherings and ministerials, and I think that's going to be an important mechanism as we go forward. Just to come back on my point also, just around policies where we are, you know, to finish off my story about our Bureau of Food Security, in fact, they just hosted a series of roundtables last week looking at what a food secure 2030 looks like, and thinking, bringing together experts to think about what that would mean for Feed the Future going forward. And one of those roundtables was specific to the SDGs. And, you know, went down the list of different SDGs and had different experts about where food security is central to achievement of the SDGs, and where things like Goal 16 and progress on the dimensions of Goal 16 also will be important for making progress on things that are within Goal 2 and Goal 1, which are around poverty. And so it's exciting to see those sorts of things because I think it means that we're all taking seriously the integrative nature and the linkages that we've been talking about on the panel of the SDGs. Having said that, I think we have to recognize there are going to continue to be challenges around that. And on this particular goal in and of itself, because it can be by those who feel like it might be difficult to make progress, or because of political situation don't want to focus as strongly on it, to make it more silent and to make government political capital around it not as robust as we'd like it to be. I think we can't use the integrative nature and the holistic framework as an excuse for us not to pay attention to it. So I think that's all of our challenge jointly as we move into SDG implementation.
And I'll end this panel where I started. It's my belief that ensuring and promoting peaceful, inclusive, and just societies is the critical development challenge of the time. It's the issue on which all other development goals pivot around. And I want to thank all of you for what you do every day to help make progress towards this goal, and to our panelists for all that they do, and also for giving us a really excellent panel today and sparking a lot of thought going forward. So thank you again to the panel. Thanks to all of you. And I would like to note that we are 3 minutes before lunch. So.